So recently I was asked about what it meant to be called. I'll answer that a bit later, but for now let me say that a calling lives into you, and you may then live into it. When it comes to being called as a pastor, I honestly admire those who can say something certain about it. I think you should know that if someone would have taken me aside on the Christmas Eve in 1986 and shared with me that this would be the last time I would have been able to sit with my family during an Easter or Christmas Eve service, then there is a very good chance I might have said, that's never going to happen. This doesn't even count the many times I have not been able to even have my family near me as I do the work that I do now. A calling has much to do with the mission you have for the life you are living. And so, each week, I ask you, what is your mission? And you respond, transformed by the crucified and risen Jesus, we are a loving community of disciples making disciples. I do not know the history of this mission statement, but it has some power to it if you believe it. If what you mean by transformation is that people here are experiencing a spiritual process leading them more and more towards a life like Christ's, then I am excited for you. We should be being shaped by the one who carries the scars and wounds of life and death while pointing us to a new hope and a new life. The one who refused to make a fist and strike out at us, but who instead opened his arms to awe and assurance and love, truly moves us to an altar state, an ALTAR state. A loving community that is consistently seeking to care as this Jesus cared is significant. In such a community, I would guess that instead of making fists of intimidation or revenge, it too seeks to be vulnerable and open to people through outstretched arms. Disciples that are constantly and consistently asking what is God's will and not seeking to primarily get their will fulfilled make a difference. Such a life requires a discipline of prayer and listening for a still small voice from God. Disciples who model and are mentors with outstretched arms of Jesus seek to reach out to others and invite them to be disciples or students of Jesus. This would mean a willingness to abandon comfort and familiarity more often than not. This is one of the realities that happened to those first disciples. Jesus called them to give up what was familiar to them and step into environments and situations overwhelmingly different for them. It isn't so much that some local boys made good as their willingness to abandon comfort and the familiar world they lived in that made a difference in the lives of others. In doing this, they discovered first, that such a move can have a powerful and positive impact on others, but it also impacts them. Jesus and his disciples did not remain in familiar places with people who backed up their view of life. Instead, they moved into new areas and did the work of helping and healing and teaching and preaching. Yes, they had difficult confrontations, which is to be expected when lines are crossed. But disagreements are natural and healthy, while polarization is not. Greater Good magazine reports that polarization has a long list of negative effects. Our families are being undermined. We are less likely to help each other. We are more stressed out. Violence is more likely. And it is becoming harder and harder for us to solve problems because of it. Disciples are going to have to make sacrifices and face hardships. But a willingness to leave the safe workplace of our existence, leave the comfortable, and leave the familiar can have a powerful and positive impact. When we reach out to others, we discover that the words of Jesus are true. The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near. What is your mission? Transformed by the crucified and risen Jesus, we are a loving community of disciples making disciples. So the other night at the council meeting, I was asked about how to know what your calling is. That was asked because apparently pastors get the call to be pastors. I was unable to give them the response perhaps some of them wanted. I want to respond a bit to that question as you consider the mission of the congregation and the mission for each of you. You will do that one way or another, by the way. You will either seek to live out your calling and your mission, or you will not. I will answer that question by asking you another question. It should give you an answer about my understanding of my calling. So I ask, did God call you to Christ through his word and draw you to the waters of baptism, making you as his own and placing every promise of the cross upon your life because God saw something awesome in you? And if you answer yes, check your spirituality out. Because the answer is no. God called you to Christ for the same reason he called those original 12 disciples, because you make an excellent object lesson on the depths of God's grace and the scope of God's power. You with your rebellious heart, you with your secret struggles, you with your lack of faith and your long list of faults, you who stand judging the lives of others because you fear being judged as less than. You who knows deep down that you are unworthy to tie God's shoe, let alone be called God's child. God chose you, chose us, so that the world might look at you and at me and see that God is indescribably merciful and incredibly powerful. That said, the question that you may be asking at this point, so what? We can proclaim the truth that God has chosen us completely out of mercy all day long, and we should. But what's the action step? How does this truth get lived out in our lives? Well, I believe the answer is found in the actions of the disciples. What do we see them doing the moment after Jesus comes and taps them on the shoulder? What do we see them doing when a rabbi comes and makes it clear that he wants them? They dropped everything and followed. They dropped their nets. James and John left their dad. Why? Because when something you don't deserve but desperately want comes knocking at your door, you don't tell it to wait 5 minutes. You answer the door as fast as you can. You drop the attitude and begin each day in gratitude. Personally, I confess, I have always thought God got it wrong with me. Like the old joke about the farmer who decided to become a pastor, but was just a terrible preacher. One of the elders of the congregation came up to him after a particularly bad and boring sermon and asked how it was that he decided to become a pastor. He told the story that one day, as he was planting soybeans, he looked in the sky and saw as clearly as you could imagine 2 letters, P.C. He told the elder that he believed that God was speaking to him, commanding him to preach Christ. The elder just stood there for a minute and finally said, "Pastor, did you ever think God was simply telling you to plant corn instead of soybeans?" I thought I was called to TC. That is, to teach children and not teach Christ. But God does what God does and continually invites each of us to follow Jesus. Frankly, I was called by other people of a congregation before I understood what the TC stood for. I want to end with this idea, not mine, but someone else's. Like those disciples who misunderstood and failed, Jesus at every turn, we too, as sinners, in need of forgiveness for our multiple betrayals. Like them, we sinners, despite our failings, are slowly being transmuted into followers of Christ. Like them, we are called not to the enjoyment of private salvation, but to a public vocation. Like them, and like Abraham, we are summoned by God to leave our parents' house, abandoning self-interest, security, and social acceptance. Like them, we can find our inadequate attempts to ministry transformed by grace into extensions of Jesus' activity of proclamation. Just as it did for the disciples, the command, "Follow me," points to the way of the cross for us. The reference to the arrest of John the Baptist warns that we too are called to a life of risk, insecurity, and self-denial. What is your mission? Well, when you're transformed by the crucified and risen Jesus, you can't help but becoming a loving community of disciples. And you can't stop seeking to make disciples.